said recording in progress, so I'm assuming that that means we're live. So let me once again, this is so special to us, to see the enthusiasm and commitment of all of you setting aside time in your busy work schedules. Everybody's busy these days, too much work, too little time. So thank you for participating in this wonderful training that Neil is leading for us. Welcome to our third and unfortunately, sadly, final day. But we're all hoping that you've enjoyed it, that you've benefited from it, and that you're going to apply these lessons. We have the great privilege of having with us today. In fact, Dr. Mukhtar has been with us previous days as well. But Dr. Mukhtar is going to just say a few words of welcome from his side in his capacity as our chair for the APMEN Vector Control Working Group. And I must tell you, he's an extremely effective, energetic, and productive chairman of our APMEN Vector Control Working Group. It is a true pleasure, a privilege to work with you, Dr. Mukhtar. So Dr. Mukhtar he's the National Director of Vector-Borne Disease Control in Pakistan, which means he doesn't only deal with malaria, although that takes up most of his time, I suspect, but it's also other things, sandflies, leishmaniasis, lymphatic filariasis, arboviruses, all the other mosquito-borne diseases. So, Dr. Mukhtar, thank you for being willing to share a few words with us. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. Dear colleagues around the globe, very good morning, good afternoon, according to your time zone. First of all, as a chair of APMEN Vector Control Working Group, would like to express my extremely sincere appreciation to Dr. Neil Lobo, an icon on vector surveillance, for delivering extremely high quality, insightful, and the informative presentation on the vector surveillance. His depth of knowledge and the practical experience providing highly valuable perspective that will certainly support the participants in strengthening their vector surveillance activities in their respective programs. I would like also thanks to all participants for their very active engagement and the thoughtful questions which made this online event highly interactive and impactful. No doubt the record-breaking registration and participation around the globe made this online course a flagship activity of APMEN. On the behalf of APMEN Vector Control Working Group, I extend my heartfelt thanks to both speakers and all the participants for making this online course extremely successful. I truly hope that the knowledge shared during the last 2 days, surely today as well, will significantly contribute to the strengthening the vector surveillance and public health interventions in respective countries and the institutions. So it's not a welcome address. It's just the appreciation for Dr. Neil Lobo and all the participants for their extremely important participation for this very important online training course. So I thank you very much for all of you for your participation. And finally, the thanks to Dr. Neil for his outstanding contribution to make this event very successful. Thank you very much. Over to Dr. Liu.
Thank you for that, Dr. Mukhtar. It's as I said, what a privilege to work with people such as yourself, such as Neil. We all share a common objective to try and make a difference and help, countries to move closer towards their malaria elimination objectives. And the kind of course that Neil is leading here makes a strong contribution towards capacity strengthening. So again, you need people to listen to it in order to absorb that knowledge. So to our audience, again, thank you for participating. So just a quick few words about the flow of the afternoon. Um, so the session will again be recorded and it will be made available at the URL that Wulan will post in the chat box. You can either go back to it yourself or you can share it with friends. We encourage you to post questions. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. In the Q&A box, that's the box we're going to monitor for questions. There's too much going on about other things in the chat box. So questions into the question and Q&A box. We're again going to ask if you could help us to understand the knowledge gain from across the duration of this course. So you did the pre-course knowledge assessment, and we're going to ask you to do a post-course knowledge assessment right at the end. So I think the way we should do this, going to hand over to Neil soon. We'll have a 45-minute lecture session, then a 10-minute break, then another 45 session. And then maybe we should have, maybe we should have Q&A. Maybe we should have the questionnaire session first. And then after the questionnaire session, we'll have Q&A. Because Q&A can be of variable length. Unless Dr. Porn or Neil or Wilan advise me otherwise, let's first do the questionnaire and then go to Q&A after that. Have I forgotten something? I think that's all. Let me again thank Neil, Dr. Mukhtar, Dr. Porn, Wulan, Amanda for all your support and so on. So over to you, Neil.
Thank you, Leo. And hey, everyone, and hope you all are doing well today. Thank you for putting up with me for the last 2 days. And today is the last day you have to deal with me. So let me share my screen. And while I'm sharing my screen, I can say that in typical entomology fashion, I'm speaking from a third site from a third place in Thailand. I'm up in northern Thailand, and actually one of the participants in the course is sitting right across from me. So he's been attending every day, and today he's right across from me. And actually, it's super helping me, working with me. I'm working with him rather at the site. So just to go over what we've done today and what we will do today. So we have been over a logical framework, right? How do we think about entomological surveillance to answer our question? How to direct our efforts, our energy, our limited funding into getting the best data possible to enable us to make the best decisions possible, which will help us protect the most people. And that's our objective, right? And to do this, we went over how to ask a question, how to make entomologically relevant questions that will direct everything. And the next step is a minimal essential indicators, or the data we would collect that would answer the question. And then the sampling method that would collect the indicators that would answer the question. What sites we should use, which I did not go over, but it's available in the ESPT document, which I hope you downloaded. And then the sampling design and how to design your sampling framework, how to collect the data, how many days to go, how many times, which house, etc. What's your sampling framework, and then how to factor in capacity and funding towards making the best surveillance to collect the best data possible. And the whole objective of all these steps, this logical framework, is to be able to understand, if you remember this slide, it's to understand how well your interventions are working. And if you understand how well they're working, you can see how to optimize them. So without any extra funding, you can actually optimize how well your interventions are functioning. Alongside how your interventions are working, we can understand how they are not working. And those are the gaps in protection, or GIPS. And if you understand your gaps in protection, you can understand what new interventions or what new strategies you may require to further reduce malaria. And now that we have been through this whole process, the next step is we are going to now use two examples. The first example is from Panama, where we look at conventional and WHO recommended strategies. And the second example is from Cambodia. And this is where we utilized non-WHO recommended strategies. We were thinking out of the box. So I thought these two examples might be really good, and this is actually what happened in the field. So I'll go over each of the examples, and after that, I have a presentation, if we have time, of lessons learned, lessons that me and my team and my colleagues have learned over the last 30, I have no idea how long, years of working together and working in the field with entomological surveillance. So to start off, malaria in Panama. So malaria in Panama has gone down significantly. In 2004, there were about 5,000 cases, but that went down significantly by 2016. However, in 2019, malaria went up. And people were trying to figure out why malaria was going up, right? There were pockets of transmission, and this was mostly in forested areas with indigenous people. And the picture on the right is people with these really elaborate, like beaded things they wear on these legs, in the Guna Yala groups of people. So the red arrow is where we worked. On the right, this is a map of Panama, and all the pink dots, all the pink spots are where there was malaria, cases of malaria. And all these areas are where the local people were more towards forested areas. So what was happening at the site, right? The Ministry of Health was conducting two interventions. One of them was IRS, Indo-residual spraying with phenithrothione, and they had been doing this for 20 years, and they reported no insecticide resistance. So they continued doing phenithrothione-based IRS. The second thing they did was larviciding, which was implemented here and there, but not really done well, and it was never evaluated. Bed nets or insecticide treated nets were available in the market, but they were not distributed by the Ministry of Health. So they were not a top down or ministry led strategy. And the main reason why bed nets were not distributed was because the mosquitoes at these sites, the anopheles at these sites, were characterized as biting outdoors. So if mosquitoes were biting outdoors, why would we give people an Indo intervention, right? It makes sense from that perspective. But let's see what our data says. So do you remember this figure? Our question was, are bed nets an effective vector control tool? That was the question. We start with a question, right? The question is, are bed nets or will bed nets be an effective vector control tool at our site? Now, remember, bed nets were available in the market, and the community, when they wanted to, they would buy bed nets to protect themselves, to provide protection. But the Ministry of Health did not distribute these bed nets. So if you remember this, we want to understand how bed nets function on the left and how they don't function on the right. They function on late night Indo-biting mosquitoes, that is mosquito behavior. They don't function if mosquitoes don't bite at that time and place. Humans have to be under them for it to be effective, and if they're not under them, bed nets are not effective. And we want to look at insecticide resistance, of course. Everything on the right is a gap in protection. Towards understanding this question, we want to understand and quantify everything on the left as well as everything on the right. So this looks at human things as well as mosquito aspects. So if you remember this figure, we want to characterize protection by bed nets as well as gaps in protection. Quantify and characterize each of these overlaps between the intervention, human behavior, and vector behaviors. So this is what happened. Here is a question on the left. So the questions, if we take this question and break it into sub-questions, the sub-questions are, what are the mosquito behaviors? When and where do they bite? correct? The second question is, what are the human behaviors? Where are the humans? Where are they in places where mosquitoes are? Are they using bed nets, right? And that would be protection if they were under a bed net. So we wanted to look at human behaviors, mosquito behaviors, and insecticide resistance status of these mosquitoes. The questions are outlined, 3 questions. The indicators to answer the first question would be the human biting rate inside and outside houses, and the biting time. What time are these mosquitoes biting? The indicators for the second question are human behaviors, are the temporal location. Are they inside? Are they outside? What time are they inside? What time are they outside? Are they awake or are they asleep? What time are they awake and what time are they asleep? And if they were using bed nets, and what time they were using the bed nets. And the third is, of course, insecticide resistance tests. When we look at the sampling methods, to answer the question 1, which indicators 1A and 1B, we were planning to do HLCs inside and outside houses. Hourly HLCs would tell us when and where mosquitoes were biting. For answer question 2, which is human behaviors, we would look at where people were, when, what they were doing there, if they were awake or asleep, and that is human behavior observations. And to answer question 3, which is insecticide resistance tests, we would look at larval surveys with CDC bottle assays. We would use CDC bottle bioassays because we could not, at that point in time, we could not get the WHO bottle bioassays. For site selection, this is a baseline survey since no one else had collected data there, but we would go back over time. So the baseline survey would be continued into a routine survey at the same structures at the same villages. And we chose 5 key sampling sites, and each of these sampling sites had slightly different cultural components. The people, the Guna people at each of these sites were slightly different and might have had different behaviors. So we wanted to factor that in. For sampling design, we wanted to have 5 time points over a year, and we'd base it on the season. We'd go to 5 sentinel houses each time we went there at each house. And for each time we went, right, 5 points in the year, we'd collect data for 10 days, right? So this was our ideal plan that we thought, yes, this will give us really, really good data. And once we got this plan down, we tried to look at capacity and funding. The NMCP discussed internal funding, and we had $50,000 from our project. And what we found is that we could not afford this. It was quite sad. We could not afford this, and we were really upset. So what did we have to do? We just followed the ESPT and went through the whole process to try and figure out what to reduce. And this is what we did. The first thing is we took out the question on insecticide resistance because we were going to answer that with another project. So we didn't have to do number 3. We kept all the same indicators in because they were really important. And for sampling methods, we kept these sampling methods in because they were really important and minimal essential. However, when we looked at site selection, instead of 5 sites, we decided to reduce it to 2 sites, and each site had very different cultural inhabitants. And actually, they were really close to each other, just across a stream, maybe a 10-minute walk away from each other. So it was easy to visit logistically. We didn't have to drive really far away. And instead of 5 time points, we went 3 times. We decided to go 3 times. Instead of 5 sentinel houses, we kept the 5 sentinel houses. And instead of 10 days of collection, we had 5 days of collection. So you can see this sort of reduced sampling strategy kept in those minimal essential indicators, reduced our sampling frame, but would still produce good data. And this fit within our budget. So this is what we moved forward with. We went through the ESPT through each step towards understanding the best way to move forward. Now, let's look at what happened data-wise. Here is just the vector behavior. Site 1 is on the left, site 2 is on the right. On the figure on the left, the y-axis is the anopheles per person per hour. This is a biting rate. Green is outdoors and red is indoors. And on the x-axis, we have the hour of collection. We actually started at 5 p.m., which is hour 1, not 6 p.m. We started early because mosquitoes were biting early. And we ended at 6 a.m., which is 13. So from 5 p.m. to 6 a.m. And what we found is that what we already kind of knew. Mosquitoes were primarily feeding outdoors early in the evening. You can see most of the mosquitoes in the green peak out here were outdoors early in the evening. Since these sites were really close to each other, we actually got similar biting profiles at each village. Most of the biting was happening outside early in the evening and less so inside. There was some biting over the course of the night, but most of it was indoors. So vectors are primarily biting indoors. Sorry, most of the biting is outdoors. Vectors are primarily biting outdoors, and most of the biting was early in the evening. And that's really important, as you can see from the analysis we did downstream. So what was the human behaviors? And I'll go through this slowly. So the green line, again, sorry, let's repeat what the x-axis is and the y-axis. I forgot to explain those. So on the x-axis, we have the hour of the night, the same hours of the night as the mosquitoes, that we collected the mosquitoes. And on the y-axis, we have the proportion of people from that household that is in each of these activities. So the green line is the proportion of people outdoors. And you can see early in the evening, most of the people are outdoors. And over the course of the night, they go indoors. So this number reduces. And in the morning, they start waking up and going outdoors again. This line, the blue line, is people indoors awake. You can see as people from outdoors go indoors, the blue goes up because people are going indoors and they're awake. And this then goes down at about hour 3 and 4 because they are going to sleep. This red line is people inside asleep, not under bed nets. You can see this proportion of people, about 70% of people, 70%, were indoors asleep, not under bed nets most of the night. And this line is people indoors asleep under bed nets. So immediately, just from this figure, just from looking at human behavior, we can see what might be happening. And you can relate this to what mosquitoes are doing, right? So now let's move on to the combined analysis. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about this. If you take each of these hours and add up the data, you can get a pie chart. And from this pie chart, you can see that throughout the night, I think it's on the next slide as well. So that's the same pie chart. You can see from throughout the night, the red is people asleep, not under bed nets indoors. The purple, this fraction is the proportion of people that are actually protected by bed nets without any national campaign. These are people buying bed nets in the community. The green is outdoors, and the blue is people indoors awake. And this is just the human behavior without the entomology behavior. What was really interesting is this is at site 2. If you remember, site 1 looked like that. Site 2 looked like that, slightly different. And if you actually compare site 1 above and site 2, you can see distinct differences. And this really amazed me, and this taught me a lot. At site 1, people went to sleep earlier than at site 2. People went, I think there's an animation here. Yes. At site 1, you can see this is when people were asleep, and at site 2, this is when people were asleep, a lot later. And the reason was because it's really interesting. The reason is because site 2 that went to sleep late had electricity. Because they had electricity, they could stay outside, they had lights on, and it was brighter. So they were staying awake a lot longer, and that actually changed their exposure profile. And you can see that in the next few slides. So another difference is that site 2 had higher LLIN use, had higher bednet use. Because they had more money, they were a richer village, they had electricity as well as better use, and they could buy more bednets. So there were distinct differences between both villages. Now, do you remember this when we combine vector behavior plus human behavior, right? And in this overlap, you can actually understand when and where people were protected in the middle. And just below the middle, you can look at the different human behaviors that resulted in exposure to mosquitoes. So on the left over here, we're now going to be looking at the human behavior adjusted biting rate or exposure, right? On the left on top here, we have the raw mosquito data. On the right, we have the human behavior from site 1. And I hope you remember how we worked through this I think on day 1 of the training. We worked through how to calculate this. And what we found is this. On the left is the proportion of exposure based on human behavior. And on the x-axis is, of course, the hour of the night. This line, the lowest line, the green line, is the exposure outdoors. The blue line and the red line is exposure indoors. The blue line is when people were inside awake, and the red line was when people were inside asleep, not under bed nets. And immediately you can see that most of the exposure is indoors. Most of the mosquitoes in our HLCs were found outdoors. But even though most of the mosquitoes were found outdoors, the exposure, the community exposure, what was happening to the community, most of the exposure was indoors. I hope that makes sense to you. This was actually really interesting to me, and this is one of the first times I'd seen this play out in real life. At site 2, this is site 2. Remember, they had electricity and they were outside more and awake longer? It was completely reversed. Most of the exposure was happening outside. So you have two communities with similar mosquito biting profiles, but each community had different behaviors. One community had more electricity, which resulted in different behaviors and bed net use, and that completely changed their exposure profiles. And as you can imagine, each of the sites might require different interventions for better protection, because in one of them, most of the exposure was happening inside, and different interventions would work inside versus at the other site outside. And here is what happens when we look at a pie chart of exposure. Site 1 is, you can see about half of it was indoors, but site 2, only about a quarter of it was inside. Site 1, about a quarter, less than a quarter of exposure was happening outdoors, but at site 2, slightly less than 3/4 was happening outdoors. So you can easily see how just combining the human landing catch data plus the human behavior observations can tell us so much more about where and when people are being exposed. And what we did now, we took this analysis and we went to the Ministry of Health. Remember our primary question? The primary question was, are bed nets or will bed nets be an effective tool in this area? And based on this, I'll give you 3 seconds to think about this based on where exposure was happening, right? This is indoors, not under bed net, indoors asleep, not under bed nets, indoors asleep, not under bed nets. These two red parts is where we can protect with bed nets. And this exposure, if reduced, would result in reduced malaria. So immediately we have quantified exposure and we have quantified the protection we might get with optimal intervention usage. So what we did was we went to the Ministry of Health and we said, here is where people in community 1 and community 2 are being exposed to malaria. Here is where we might be able to protect them. Each of these spaces and times might require different interventions. If you remember, different interventions have different modes of action. So we mapped those modes of action to these exposure places and times. For example, the green is outdoors, right? What interventions work outdoors well? We might be able to use larval source management or larviciding, which is LSM, or topical repellents, or spatial emanators or spatial repellents. If we look at indoors when people are awake, we obviously cannot give a person a bed net and ask him to walk around with a bed net around them. So we can possibly use topical repellents or spatial repellents. Remember that IRS was already conducted, so we did not, suggest IRS. And the third one is when people are indoors asleep without bed nets, can we actually increase bed net use? Can the Ministry of Health provide bed nets? And that was the primary question, right? Can bed nets be a useful strategy in this place? And of course, all the intervention measures on the left are the same as the measures on the right, but they would have a different impact, a different quantifiable impact on exposure in each of these communities. So what did the country decide to do? Panama decided to do a proof of principle study by trying to increase bednet use. They decided to do that. This was not us. We just provided the data. And this is what happened. In site one, this figure on the left is the same as the figure on the left over here. And what happened was, in March 2019, there was a bednet distribution plus social behavior change communication. So the Ministry of Health distributed bednets to this community, and with the information about bednet use, about how it would protect people, it was in the local language, local people did that. And by July, August of 2019, same year, wait, how many months is that? March, April, May, June, July. 4 to 5 months later, look at what happened with exposure. It completely changed. The country made an evidence-based decision. They saw where and when people were being exposed to malaria, and they figured out which intervention would work best in that place, and they applied it. And what happened was the red on the left reduced significantly by 93 to 94% to the red on the right. The blue actually went down because people had SBCC and they realized that they were being exposed indoors and they wanted to go to sleep and under their nets earlier. So that actually changed. And interestingly, the green is almost exactly the same. Since this pie chart depicts proportions, the green on the left is the same as the green on the right, and the blue and the red is significantly smaller. And if we look at actual numbers, I think I have that. Yes. See, in the top left, you can see what it looks like when we do proportions. And when we look at actual numbers, you can see the people in each, the exposure based on each behavior. On the left, we have when they were inside awake, you can see they actually went to sleep earlier. They went under their bed nets earlier. So that went down. On the right, all the way on the right in the green, you can see pre and post outside exposure remained the same. People stayed out the similar amounts of time because just like me, I prefer to be outside. And you can see when we look at bed net use, the big red bar in the middle is basically people asleep without bed nets. And after SBCC and bednet distribution, this went down 94%. Significant. The country made an evidence-based decision and completely helped protect their people. I hope this was a huge lesson to me, and I learned so much from the study. And a super important part is we answered the question, right? Are bednets an effective control tool? And the answer is bednets are an appropriate and effective intervention, but it is not enough as a single or a sole intervention. Just as you can see as on the figure on the right from Village 2, right? Bednets will only work in some areas, not in all spaces and times, right? Other interventions must also be included to address the identified gaps in protection. So the figure, the little picture on the right is actually post bednet distribution. I made a mistake earlier. It's not Village 2, it is post bednet distribution. Even with bednets and SBCC, we've reduced exposure significantly, but exposure remains outdoors, mainly outdoors, and now we want to address that transmission outdoors. The really cool thing is that we've quantified it. We know how much it is, and this should be reflected in our epidemiological outcomes when we look at case data from clinics, and this was reflected there. So we can actually see the evidence-based impacts of the evidence-based, now how do I make a sentence? We can actually see the impact of evidence-based decisions. And here is a newspaper article that actually came out in Panama, where they did this mosquito net campaign, and they actually utilized the communities to help with the SBCC and bednet distribution. And all this was based on a small study that we did using the ESPT, right? So the indigenous people, the local people, took charge of this and made the best they could and protected themselves with evidence. And by the way, this can be applied to every single one of your sites. And I'm really happy to say that just yesterday, someone told me on WhatsApp that this sort of approach to understanding both protection and gaps in protection is being applied in Bhutan, where they are doing a mass distribution of PBO bed nets, and they're going to look at human exposure based on mosquitoes and human behaviors. And I'm so happy they are doing this because this is sort of leading the edge of how we can combat malaria and how we can understand what's happening with malaria in terms of simple, minimal essential indicators and simplified, cheaper, less costly studies. The last slide on this is, oh no, oh God, as usual, I'm completely forgetting. We had another question in Panama, and this is actually really cool too. They wanted to know, is IRS an effective vector control tool? If you remember, they had been doing IRS for 20 years, and malaria started to go up, and they continued to do IRS. There was no more protections happening. So on the left is how IRS functions, on the right is how IRS does not function. IRS functions on indoor resting mosquitoes. If your mosquitoes does not rest indoors, it's not going to be effective. IRS have to be susceptible to the insecticide. If they are resistant, IRS is not going to be that effective. So on the right are the gaps in protection. So we wanted to measure left and right. We wanted to measure the data on left and right to be able to understand what was happening. What we did was we utilized the data in the BedNet study alongside this to further understand what was happening with IRS. So here's what happened. Again, is IRS an effective vector control tool? We wanted to look at the mosquito behaviors, the insecticide resistance status, and the impact on exposure, that is human behaviors plus HLCs, which we already had that data from the BedNet study that I just went through. For the IRS, we want to look at the indoor resting rate of mosquitoes. Are they resting on walls indoors? And we want to look at insecticide resistance. And as we just described, we use the same data from the BedNet study, HLCs plus HBOs. The sampling methods were indoor aspirations inside houses. So we went into houses every 2 hours throughout the night and collected all the Anopheles landing there. And of course, larval sampling for insecticide resistance. And as we previously mentioned, HLCs and HBOs. So our sampling methods, 1, 2, 3, map to our indicators, 1, 2, 3, which map to our questions, 1, 2, 3, right? Working backwards. We wanted to do 5 key sampling sites with 2 separate cultural inhabitants as before, 5 time points, 5 sentinel houses, 10 days each collection. And of course, we did not have the funding, quite unfortunate. So we went back and we changed it. We used the impact on exposure endpoints from the BedNet study. We reduced the sampling from 5 sites to only 1 site. We did not have enough of a budget. 3 time points, 15 sentinel houses for the indoor aspirations. We did quite a lot, and 5 days of collection each, and we could actually do this. So we went through, made our ideal sampling our surveillance strategy. We adjusted our surveillance strategy to fit within our budget and went forward with the best data that we could collect possible. And the next slide is everything on one slide, and I'll walk through this slowly. So the question is IRS an effective tool? And that's what we want to answer. And the 2 parts of that question is, are the indoor resting behaviors known? And you can imagine in a decision tree, it would be yes or no. And so we collected the data, which was indoor aspirations. And I'll go through each of these and show you what we found. The next question is insecticide susceptibility, and we collected larvae and did CDC bottle assays with transflutrin. So now, do you remember in the BedNet study, we did indoor and outdoor HLCs? On average, indoors, we found 7.8 mosquitoes inside a house over the course of a night. On average, outdoors with HLCs, we found 30.5 mosquitoes. So overall, about, let's say, 38.5, 38.3, oh, I can't do math well, about 38.3 mosquitoes were approaching every house every night, indoors and outdoors. And indoors, when we did our indoor aspirations, we did not do PSCs. That's a mistake. It should be indoor aspirations. In our indoor aspirations, over the space of an entire year, we caught one male mosquito, who was, I assume, was lost. We found zero female mosquitoes. So of every house, over the course of an entire year, with about 38 mosquitoes approaching every house, zero were resting indoors. And just from that, do you think IRS would be an effective intervention? The answer is probably not. Now, when we looked at insecticide susceptibility, right, about 26.3 of them actually survived the insecticide resistance tests, which means they are resistant. That is also a gap in protection. So from this data, from this minimized set of data, we can easily see that even though mosquitoes are approaching houses, they're not resting indoors. And even the ones they're not resting indoors, the primary vectors, they're resistant. So what had probably happened over time, over the last 20 years of IRS, and of course we don't have data to prove it, but what had probably happened, and here this is a theory, a hypothesis, I don't have data to back it up. What probably happened is that the mosquitoes got resistant through continual exposure to phenyltrethione, and their behavior changed at the same time, and they were biting outdoors more, or not going, sorry, they were resting indoors less. So they became resistant and did stop resting on walls. They were going indoors, feeding, and leaving before they rested. So now our intervention resulted in us in mosquitoes that were refractory. They were not being impacted by the intervention. So this, of course, changed national policy in Panama, also with regards to IRS. And you can also do this at your site. This was published, and you can look up the publication if you wanted to. And I wanted to say one thing. The first author, Mario Avia, him, that's him right in the center. He was in charge of the entomology for the country and entomological surveillance for the country. And none of us could have done any of this without him. Because we were pushing up against a system that had been functioning for 20 years, and he wanted to make a change and he wanted to reduce exposure, he fought everyone and everything to get all these permissions approved, to get the insecticide resistance tests, to get everything done. Without him, we could not have done any of this. It takes one person. In this country, it was Mario Avia. It takes one person to make a huge difference and protect so many people. Just the simple BedNet study reduced exposure by 94%. That's huge. And that's Mario. That's all Mario. And this means that every single one of you on this training can do the exact same thing. All you need is like, exactly, I can see all the clapping things. That's for Mario. I agree. Every one of us can do this. Every one of us can hope to be a Mario. Yeah. So that was my brief presentation on Panama, a study that looked at something that was contradictory, outdoor biting mosquitoes, but indoor exposure. And we were looking at normal WHO recommended interventions, bed nets and IRS. And in this next presentation, we're going to look at something slightly different, right? In the forests of Cambodia, which is close to where I am. Oh, it's the other side of the country where I am right now. We were trying to figure out what might work at these sites. So when we look at elimination in the greater Mekong subregion, which is this entire image on the right, what we want to do is to find appropriate, acceptable, and effective tools. We want to get them to the right people who are at high risk and in the right places, right? We don't have enough funds. We don't have enough capacity. There's so much we cannot do. And whatever we can do, we have to focus in on it and do it right. So We want to get appropriate tools, effective tools, acceptable tools to the high risk, appropriate people and in the right places. And the little circle on the right is where we worked. So here, this is a map of Cambodia, and we worked right here in Mondulkiri. Now, in Mondulkiri, most of the transmission is happening in people who live in and around forested areas. The vectors are dirus and minimus and similar vectors to where I am right now in Thailand, and unknown vectors, of course, and different vectors. But people, the main three target people, populations that have the malaria are people who live in forests. They just live there. The villages are in the forest. People who visit the forests for work, and they do things like cutting down trees, mushroom farming, hunting, and things like that, as well as World Wildlife Fund rangers, people who patrol the forests and look after the wildlife. These three groups of people have the most malaria, or rather, almost all the malaria in Cambodia, these target groups. And from the picture, you can see they live when they go to sleep in these sort of temporary structures, or the forest dwellers live in super open structures, but they're very open. You cannot, it is really hard to put up a bed net in these structures. And it is impossible to spray when there's no walls to spray. Uh, so that is what we wanted. These are the target populations we wanted to work with. Now, remember this figure again. Sorry if you're bored of it, but it's important. We wanted to understand, first of all, what were the human behaviors, what were the vector behaviors, and understanding that where human behaviors were overlapping with vector behaviors, what the gaps in protection, then we wanted to figure out what interventions would work in those gaps in protection, because these are not traditional structures. These are not traditional human behaviors. We have to think outside the box and think of other novel interventions. And because sometimes one intervention will only work so much, we wanted to see if we could use multiple interventions that sort of work with each other to increase protection. So we wanted to see if we could layer interventions, put one intervention over another to completely reduce exposure or reduce exposure a lot more. Different interventions work differently, so together they might protect people more. This was our objective. So when we looked at the forest transmission site, we had these questions. Basically, what are people doing? Now, what are they doing during the day? What are they doing during the night? What are their activities? When we looked at the mosquitoes, what are mosquitoes doing? When are they biting? Where are they biting? And what interventions might be appropriate in these spaces and times? So we'd characterize the gaps in protection in terms of location and time and try and see which intervention worked there. So we realized we had three sort of exposure spaces. One of them was when people were asleep inside these temporary structures on the left. The other one was in the evenings when they were all hanging out and relaxing and eating food, and they were cooking and drinking. They were drinking a lot. And then the third was when they actually went to the forest to work or cut trees or hunt or look for mushrooms or whatever they were doing. And for each of these sort of exposure spaces, we had to think of intervention or intervention groups that might function well. Is what we sort of decided. So in these temporary structures, oops, I'm sorry, this is not, it's a bit off center and not covered well. But in temporary structures, we thought of a passive volatile pyrethroid spatial repellent, or you can call it a spatial repellent or a spatial emanator, but a passive one. A passive one is one that you just hang up and forget about it. You don't have to do anything with it every day. We also had an active spatial repellent, which is a spray, which means you have to do something. You have to pick it up and spray it, right? We had treated clothing, insecticide treated clothing, and that was with etofen prox. And the last one is topical repellents, a lotion, a repellent lotion that you'd put in your hands and on your skin. And so all these four would work in the temporary structure. Then outside the temporary structure, when they were just hanging out, these would work. The same four would work. We could use the same intervention in both spaces. And the last one was when they were in the forest, since we cannot carry the volatile spatial repellent, uh, we thought of just the treated clothing and a topical repellent. So we thought this intervention package might work with this group of people. And we decided to evaluate each intervention alone and together. So this is what the forest pack, like, can we provide these people with a forest pack which with enough intervention for a certain amount of time, enough interventions, plural, with a certain amount of time, so we can cover multiple spaces and times of exposure. And here's pictures of them. The spatial emanator is circled in this semi-field system hut. It just looks like that. This is the active spatial repellent spray that they would spray right where they were. This is treated civilian clothing. So we realized people had two types of clothing, short pants and short sleeve shirts, as well as the forest rangers wore long pants and long sleeve shirts. And both of them might offer different amounts of just normal protection without an intervention. So we paired this with topical repellents. So we had the treated clothing with topical repellents, because what we realized in another study was that when a person had treated clothing, the mosquitoes just landed on their hands. They were not repellent treated clothing, they were just treated clothing. So the mosquitoes were not repelled, and they'd be attracted to them and just land on their hands or their feet or their faces because they were exposed and it was food. So we paired the treated clothing with topical repellents, and together we demonstrated in another study that they were more effective than just one alone. So again, evidence-based decision making. So here is what we did. Some of you might have seen this picture before. It is in a forest in Cambodia. It is a clearing. You can see just the raw forest behind. This is a forest clearing. And in each of these white tents, we had one intervention, and I'll explain which ones. And in one tent, we had all these interventions together, treated clothing plus topical repellents plus spatial emanators. And we evaluated how each of these affected mosquito landing over the course of 49 days. It was a Latin square, so we rotated all the tents and we rotated all the interventions to take away positional bias, because one site might get a lot more mosquitoes and bias our study. So this is what we found. On the left is day 1, and on the right is day 49. On the y-axis is cumulative mosquitoes. So we just add the number of mosquitoes from this day to the previous day, and we see the total number of mosquitoes. On the top is the control without any intervention, and we got 3,537 mosquitoes. Now, these colors have gone off in this, but the top two are the APMEN treated ranger uniforms, so long sleeve, long pants with the topical repellents. One of them was freshly treated, and one of them had 20 washes. We wanted to see the impact of 20 washes on the APMEN treated clothing. And the lower two are the civilian clothing, which is short pants and short sleeves. And you can see all these four actually had quite a good impact, more than 50% reduction in landing. However, when we looked at the package with everything together, combined, we got 124 mosquitoes only, which is significant. And when we look at just the passive volatile pyrethroid spatial emanator or spatial repellent, it was 138. And please note, this was repeated a ton of times. And I would not, and I've said this so many times, I would not have believed this data. Oops, sorry. I went ahead by mistake. I would not have believed a 94% reduction in landing outdoors in an area like this, with wind blowing through, with rainfall soaking us. I would have not have believed this if I was not in this tent right in the middle, watching and observing. This study was run by Dina Doom from Cambodia, who is fantastic to work with if anyone wants to work with him. but he was running the study, but I was in this tent and observed things. And I completely believe this data because of that. It was amazing. A 94% reduction in landing based on just this passive spatial emanator. Pretty cool. So here we took data, we sort of tried to understand uh, what was happening with the community in terms of what human behaviors were and what mosquito behaviors were. We outlined the gaps in protection and tried to fit these tools within each gap in protection. And as you can see, every single one of them had quite a huge impact on mosquito landing, right? And one of them had a really huge landing on impact on mosquito landing. And the next step was to actually, the country decided to implement this in 27 villages in 2 sites across Cambodia. And we distributed this to people. It was an implementation study. So we distributed this to people and tried to look at what people thought of these products and if they actually used them. And what we found was really, again, very interesting. After some time, we had two villages, two groups of villages. MDK is Mondal Kiri out here, and KS is Kampong Spew. So in the MDK or Mondal Kiri villages, only about 8% of people were using the topical repellent inside and outside. And that was less in the Kampong Spew villages. So very few people were using it, and 0% used it in the forest. When we looked at treated clothing, the usage was also low in Mondal Curry and very low in Kampong Spew. So even though our scientific data, a well-designed study demonstrated that you could have more than a 50% impact, in real life, people did not use these products. So scientific data, our scientific controlled research studies have to map into what people want to use and will use. So you can see how we've made all this effort, but the communities just didn't like it and it wasn't that effective. However, when we looked at bite barrier, which is the spatial emanator, the spatial repellent, because you just put it up in your house and forget about it, there was 100% usage. And this tool demonstrated the most sort of likelihood of success because people didn't have to use it every day. You have to use your topical repellent every day. You have to use your Etofen Prox treated clothing every day. But bite barrier, you can hang it up and forget it. And that demonstrated the most use at these villages. So it's so important to understand what tool is appropriate for what community, even though you might have really good data that demonstrates impact in research studies. So what we also did was we conducted human behavior observations and SBCC, and the SBCC, the social behavior change communication. And I think I have the slide on this. Let's check the next slide. Oh yeah, 100% usage of that, low usage of that. So then we looked at gaps in protection, and this figure is a little complicated, but
Neil,
yes.
sorry, I'm not sure what else you would like to deal with, but we've kind of gone over the allotted time. We can continue if you're not at a good point to
Yeah,
stop,
I
but try and find a point where we can maybe
stop.
pause for 10 minutes.
Okay, I have 3 slides, I think, and then I can
All
stop.
right.
I
Okay.
talk too much sometimes, sorry.
Not at
So we
all. Not.
so we also looked at where and when exposure, right? The HLCs plus the HBOs. And what we found is the shortest version of this was most of the exposure was still happening when people were asleep without bed nets, right? And the significance is of these results where human behavior, understanding human behavior is super important, no matter how effective the intervention is. Even though most of the mosquitoes were biting outdoors, just like Panama, the exposure was happening indoors. And a super important thing also was that we need appropriate social behavior communication strategies, because I feel that an optimal social behavior communication strategy targeting the local communities, using them and their ideas and what they think is good and not good, would definitely increase uptake. So the key messages to these two presentations, one on WHO recommended interventions and the other one on non-WHO, thinking outside the box interventions, is that understanding gaps in protections is important. We can make decisions on appropriate interventions based on the evidence. And the cool thing is we can even manage expectations of impact, because your data will say only if you give everyone a bed net, you'll only reduce 50% of exposure. Therefore, expect at least a 50% impact on transmission. One intervention is not going to take away all transmission, correct? But now we can actually quantify it. Evidence-based decisions will reduce transmission. You can use the ESPT to do that, and you can make a difference. Absolutely can. And this is the last slide for this, is before DDT, malariologists, us, we were trained to be problem solvers, right? But after DDT, we were trained to be solution implementers. And this means that after DDT, people were told, here's some DDT, go spray every house. Here's a bed net, go give it to everyone. And we stopped being problem solvers. We stopped trying to think, what is my local population doing? What are the local mosquitoes doing? What intervention might work best in this situation? We're just giving out bed nets and IRS, and we need to go back to being problem solvers. And I hope you see that the problem solving approach that we have presented actually gives us good results. And I think we can do a break now.
All right. Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating insights there from the Cambodia study. Thank you so much for that, Neil. So we're going to resume in 10 minutes. Please, everyone, go out, stretch your legs, get a cup of tea or something. Allow Neil to soothe his throat also, and we'll get back in 10 minutes. Thank you, everyone. See you soon. If we could start again, please. There we go. All right. Thank you for that wonderful background music. Very soothing. Hopefully everyone has had a chance to stretch your legs and get some refreshments. So we're going to go back to Neil for as much time as he needs to round off his presentations. And then we are going to go to the knowledge assessment questionnaire. Wulan will explain to us how to access that link. And then after the knowledge assessment questionnaire, then we'll have the Q&A session. Always an extremely valuable session where the audience members have an opportunity to pose questions and Neil will respond to as many as he can. Again, reassure everyone that if we don't have time to address all of those questions, Neil has committed to, Wulan will harvest all the questions and Neil will respond to them and we will send them out, post them, make it available. So all your questions will be responded to. So Neil, over to you, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey everyone, hope you had a good 10-minute break. And I will share my screen. And this is the last presentation for today, after which we go into the question and answer session. So here is my favorite slide I've ever made. And this presentation is on lessons we have learned over the years based on entomological surveillance that hopefully you will be able to apply to your site, to how you function, and when you think about eliminating malaria. So again, you remember the slide. This is sort of a bit of a repeat of a few things, but hopefully it will, make a point in your brain. It'll make a mark in your brain. We are losing ground. Malaria, we have had considerable success with malaria and reduced malaria significantly across the world, with 47 countries that are declared malaria-free, but malaria is going up. The last malaria report, the WHO malaria report, demonstrated 9 million more cases than the previous year. We know our current vector control interventions. The core ones are bed nets and IRS, and our supplemental interventions are right now larval source management or larviciding and spatial emanators. As we just discussed, every single tool that we use needs to be context dependent. Every single tool functions differently. Every single tool will be differently effective at different sites based on the mosquitoes and our humans and so on. We went through this, you know this. I'm just repeating it to hopefully make a mark. With transmission, the remaining transmission, whether it's high or low, we might be doing a few things wrong. And the first thing is repeating the same intervention again and again and again when its efficacy has gone down for multiple reasons that we went through. Another very important thing is we might be focusing on coverage over exposure. So coverage means when we say we want to get at least 80% bed net coverage. However, what if we focus on exposure? Where and when are people being exposed to malaria? Where and when are they being bitten? And then fitting those interventions through those places and times. In addition, evidence and data has shown that a lower coverage of a higher quality or a better intervention is more effective than higher coverage of a lesser intervention. And just for example, with bed nets, the new bed nets that have more than one active on them, those new bed nets, lower coverage of those bed nets are much more effective than higher coverage of a plain pyrethroid based bed net. So just from that, are we focusing on the wrong thing? Should we be focusing on better interventions and focusing on an exposure versus just coverage? And of course, the last thing is We make decisions based on so many reasons. It can be politics, it can be the funders telling us what to do, it can be so many things. But we need to be making evidence-based decisions. And I'm pretty sure you would agree with that. And hopefully we can change everything, how we function moving forward. So here are like sort of 10 lessons that we have learned, and I'll go through each one of them. You do not have to memorize this slide. I will be going through each one of them. And I'll be using examples. Hopefully, some of these examples I've already been through so that you do not have to, so I do not have to spend too much time on them. But I'll be using examples from research. So the first one, as you can tell, this entire training is that focused entomological surveillance is key to understanding what you are protecting and where the gaps in protection are, right? Ask a question first and understand what decision the question will impact, and focus your efforts on that decision and collect only decision relevant data. Focus on the minimal essential data. And that is based on the ESPT, but that is just an overall lesson. That's the first lesson I learned. And just as an example, we just went through this example in Panama, where we used minimal essential indicators to understand if bed nets were effective. And you remember this slide, where that data, that very specific and very little data, a few entomological endpoints with human behavior, a decision based on that data completely reduced exposure. That is sort of the first lesson, second lesson. The first lesson, not the second lesson. The second lesson is human behavior drives exposure. It's not just mosquitoes. The presence of humans defines the risk there. And this can be because of so many things. You can have evening and outdoor exposure, indoor exposure before people go to bed. You can have people with different jobs, for example, out in the forest, with the Cambodia example. You can have people not using bed nets. In this picture, you can see a child sleeping, but half the child is outside the bed net being exposed, right? The timing and location of what humans are doing are really important. And an important part of exposure is that it changes. It's dynamic. It changes by seasons. If it's rainy, people tend to be indoors. If it's not rainy, people tend to be outdoors. If it's super hot, people don't want to sleep under bed nets. They want to sleep outside where it's cooler or on their roofs, like in Mali, and they are being exposed to mosquitoes. So understanding what humans are doing at your site is super important to understanding where exposure is happening. And every one of you, if you don't have this data, you can go out and collect it over the next couple of seasons and actually hugely increase your understanding of where exposure is happening. And here's an example of from Panama that I just went through. Two different sites, two different exposure, two different behaviors, and two different exposure profiles. One was indoors. Most of the exposure was happening indoors on the left in red, and one was outdoors in green, based on human behaviors. Heterogeneity is normal. This means that malaria transmission, the drivers of malaria transmission, are different over space and time, right? This picture on the right is from 2018. This is India, and each of those colors is a state, and each color demonstrates different amounts of malaria. However, I'm absolutely sure you know that the entire state, right, does not have the same amount of malaria over the entire state. So national averages, the averages we use, mask, they hide the local risk, right? In the light green places, which have less transmission, there might be areas of high transmission that actually require different interventions to reduce it. But these national averages hide risk. Subnational variation in exposure actually is more relevant to us. We need to make our decisions based on the subnational variation. So that's where SNT, right, or subnational targeting, SNT, subnational targeting, yes, subnational targeting actually works well. Where and when is the risk? Where and when is the exposure? And what interventions actually fit best? And in some areas, you might not even need to distribute interventions because there's less malaria or less risk, or maybe all the malaria is being imported, right? And in that way, you can conserve money, especially in this day and age where we don't have enough funds, conserve capacity and focus in on the areas that need the most support. Here's an example from the Ethiopia highlands. I did not present this earlier. And what we find is that in the highlands, and you just drive down and it's the lowlands. And in the highlands, the dark blue, oh, I'm sorry, I again forgot to explain the X and Y axes. On the y-axis in both figures is the human behavior-based adjusted biting rate. So we used human behavior plus HLCs. And then the x-axis is the time of the night. The dark blue and the light blue is exposure indoors, and the orange is exposure outdoors. The bed net-like pattern is basically protection with bed nets. And you can see in the highlands, most of the exposure is happening indoors, and in the lowlands, most of the exposure is happening outdoors early in the evening. As you can see how heterogeneity just in a local place, just really close to each other based on altitude and human behavior can be very different. Obviously, the highlands would require different interventions than the lowlands, and that's important. The fourth lesson is that vectors adapt, vectors change, and we've been through this before. We are fighting evolution. If we put pressure on a system, it's going to push back. If we try and kill off mosquitoes, they are trying to survive. They are going to push back. And we need to expect things to change. Things will change. And the three things that change mostly, as we discussed, are species compositions, behaviors, which are indoor versus outdoor biting, or the time of biting, they start biting earlier on, and insecticide resistance. In addition to this, we have to factor things like Anopheles stevensii, which are invasive insects, invasive vectors. So you can have an invasive species come in and completely change everything happening at the site. And we see this happening in the Horn of Africa. We see this happening in Djibouti and Ethiopia, where a new species coming in, which is more urban, Anopheles stevensii, is changing transmission and causing outbreaks. And the example I went through was the Solomon Islands, where initially they used to feed in the middle of the night. We put in interventions. They started feeding early in the evening. And you've seen the slide before. And that means that even though the indoors had all these interventions, bed nets and IRS, all the biting was actually happening outdoors. The mosquitoes changed their behavior to avoid the interventions. We need to expect mosquitoes to change their behaviors. We need to expect mosquitoes to adapt. And when we put in an intervention, we should try and figure out, try and understand how will mosquitoes change and survey for that. Include that in your surveillance plans. So include in your surveillance plans everything that you might expect to change so you can respond to it appropriately. I put in larval control here as another lesson because larval control and larviciding, right, it's actually effective. A lot of people conduct this. However, a lot of it fails. Larviciding is effective when the larval sites are few, fixed, and findable, right? But you have to be able to detect them, and they have to be detectable. Or rather, they need to be detectable, and you need to detect them. You need to find them and then treat them, right? If they're spatially predictable, they're easier to find and treat because every larval site you do not treat produces vectors that can give you malaria. Larviciding fails not because the tool is ineffective. It is effective, but it fails because of operational weaknesses. For example, you have this on the next slide as well on top. They fail because you can't detect the larval signs better. There is inconsistent or incomplete coverage. You cannot treat all these larval sites over time. And there's weak monitoring of your larviciding activity, and that's process evaluation, right? If you do not conduct larviciding well, you are not going to have an impact. So you have to monitor the processes, process evaluation. And after your process evaluation is conducted well and you actually ensure that you've done larviciding well, You can actually look at the impact, and your impact might be relevant epidemiologically, and your impact is reflected by your process. If you do it well, you will have a good impact. And this allows you to have a good feedback loop where you evaluate and respond and evaluate and respond and get better over time. Now, the Gates Foundation has actually funded multiple three studies that actually look at tech-enabled larviciding, technology-enabled larviciding using drones and AI. And those are all aimed at reducing all these weaknesses, detecting larvicides, treating larvicides, monitoring quality and coverage. The tech is supposed to reduce that and therefore increase your process, the quality of your process, and therefore increase the impact. And towards that, just as a note, we are working with Sora, which is a drone and AI-based company out of Japan, towards understanding how to map and deliver larvicides. On this picture on the right, it's from Mozambique. The drones actually identified all the larval sites. You can see the little blue dots across the space and time. And Sora has actually joined forces with Zap, which is an AI-based company. So can we use technology to increase larviciding efficacy? Towards understanding both the process and impact evaluation and doing it well, we have produced with the Malaria Elimination Initiative a clear evaluation framework that outlines how to do appropriate process evaluation as well as impact evaluation. And that is, I had please email me and I can send you a link to the document if you wanted to read it. It's actually pretty cool, and it actually enables you to understand what you did and what you didn't do, and what the reason for the impact you see or you don't see. If you don't see an entomology impact or an epidemiology impact, this way of evaluating larviciding will tell you what went wrong or what happened. So you can see that even though larviciding works, we need to put into place specific things that enable it to work. I did not talk about larviciding over the last 3 days, but hopefully this single slide will give us a good idea of larviciding, because it is a supplemental intervention recommended by WHO. Here's an important one. Insecticide resistance is not always the answer, right? All of us do insecticide resistance, and this picture is actually from Panama, if you remember, where we did insecticide resistance with IRS. And on the right is all the control mosquitoes dead. And on the left is all the mosquitoes that we captured from the field alive. They were resistant. But we looked at resistance, and they were resistant, but the mosquitoes were not resting on walls. So it didn't matter if the mosquitoes were resistant or susceptible. The mosquitoes were not going to be impacted by the IRS anyway. So if we focused on resistance, the country might have changed the insecticide and it would have still been ineffective. So the question is, where is exposure happening, right? And combat the exposure and not necessarily the resistance. Resistance is important, but it's not always resistance. And we have to understand the full picture, right? We often stress on resistance, but is it something else, right? And here's a question that we don't know the answer of, or rather, I'm asking you to think about it. When you detect resistance, is it already too late, right? Entomology, all our entomological surveillance must link to transmission. We want to link our entomological data to transmission, to malaria, right? So surveillance, if we're doing surveillance towards a specific decision, we want to link this to disease, right? And just for an example, right, vector density, what is happening with the number of anopheles might explain the changes in incidence, might explain the amount of malaria. When you have shifts in species compositions, shifts in biting behavior, changes in resistance, this might explain intervention failure. So entomology can actually explain all this, right? All of a sudden, if your entomological surveillance demonstrates that you have a new vectors present, for example, in Anopheles stevensii, you might have an added or different impact of your interventions, or you might have an impact on disease. And overall, this, you have to factor in human behavior. And this sounds like a lot. But from the last 3 days, you can actually see, if you think about it, it's actually not that difficult to think about. It's a lot of things, but it's easy to think about. Entomology tells us why your malaria cases go up or go down. Oh, wait, I went backwards, sorry. And here's an example from Namibia, where we have two sites, Ohangwena and Kavango East, and we had different epidemiological profiles, right, based on age. And what was interesting is we had the same vector, Arabiensis, but at two sites, it had two completely different behaviors. At one site in Ohangwena, the Anopheles arabiensis were feeding outdoors mostly. So most of the exposure was happening outdoors, not indoors. So when people went indoors and kids went indoors early, they had less malaria. But Anopheles arabiensis and Kavango East were biting indoors and outdoors. And here we could see that even when people went indoors, they had transmission happening. Same vector, different places, different behavioral profiles, different epidemiological profiles. Your vectors, your entomological surveillance can explain what's happening transmission-wise. And here's another thing that we talked over with respect to the Cambodia example, where we layered tools. Even though bed nets and IRS are foundational, they are important, we know they work, right? Can we use complementary tools to fill in gaps, right? For example, bed nets will function that way. And can we use another tool, for example, spatial emanators, to fill in all the gaps when people are awake indoors or when people are outdoors, and therefore increase protections? Now, I know this is really hard to do with our present funding envelopes, which has all gone down, but if it's possible to do, if it's possible to try and get funding, this would totally work. And you can see from the Cambodia example that even though we did not use bed nets and IRS, it was pretty effective. It's important to target your gaps in protection. More importantly, then use something new and cool. So even though spatial emanators are supposedly new and cool and a new intervention, I would focus on the gaps in protection and see what fits there. It might be spatial emanators, it might be IRS, it might be anything, but focus on those gaps in protection and see which tool fits in that space. Focus on targeting over just new cool products. Here's a Cambodia example that I went through. And those are, you remember the slide from earlier on today. And you remember that where we conducted all this. And you remember this data, of course, where we had a huge impact. The second to last lesson learned is that funding realities demand focus. We don't have enough funds. We don't have enough capacity. I think about 45 to 47% of the world's funding disappeared this year for malaria. Huge amounts, slightly less than half, which is ridiculous. And we have to stop doing things. We have to stop doing things that are not that effective, where we're wasting money. Low value entomology, right? We cannot do low value entomology when we have less funding. If there's an end-to-end point with no decision point, if it's not directed at decisions, do not include it. If you're doing just random collections here and there, and if you're not doing temporal questions that enable you to understand what's happening over time, do not do it. If you have data collected that you're never using, obviously do not do it, because represents all your time, your effort, like nights out in the field without any sleep. Yep, go to sleep, get some sleep. It's more important than collecting all that data. Entomology needs to be connected to decision planning, what your Ministry of Health is doing, what the decisions are, the important things that can actually protect people's lives. Data without purpose is wasted funds and effort. So, for example, we are using the ESPT, or this sort of decision framework, at multiple sites across the world. And hopefully, At all these sites, we're using better minimal essential indicators and endpoints with clearer questions and decisions, and trying to have the strategies adapt, the national strategies or the local strategies adapt to the strategies adapt to the data that comes out. So as the data comes out, we want to try and adapt the strategies to them. And as you can see, we have multiple sites around the world where we are working with both local researchers as well as local governments. Adaptive strategies, right? On the previous slide, we collect the data. We want to have adaptive strategies. These adaptive strategies outperform plans that just don't change. Interventions evolve. We have different interventions. Mosquitoes change. Humans change. Different populations change. The weather and climate is changing. And we remain the same with respect to what we're doing. That does not make sense to me. So we need to adapt, right? Adapt our surveillance to inform us based on everything that's happening around us in terms of interventions and mosquitoes and humans and climate and everything. Subnational tailoring is so important. Evidence-based deviation. So based on the evidence, change your plans, deviate from what you've been doing for all these years, because that will be more effective. And once you start taking ownership, right, we start taking ownership of what we do and how we make decisions, we are going to have a much bigger impact on malaria. So the key message is that all these drivers of transmission are not mysterious. They're not some strange thing that we don't understand and cannot understand. Entomological surveillance is the key tool that will help us understand this. It'll help us understand the gaps in protection, which is where every single one of your malaria cases is coming from. Right? It'll actually tell you that. It can quantify that. It can help you understand that. And then you can use this data to make decisions to close these gaps in protection, to fill these gaps in protection. You can precisely target these gaps in protection. And this precise targeting is better than trying to get 90% coverage of bed nets. Precisely target your population, precisely targeting your population will better protect your people. And I think the last three words are adapt, adapt, adapt. And you remember this slide, and that was my last slide. I hope that was useful.
Indeed, indeed. Neil, I'm extremely disappointed that the course has come to an end. How absolutely fascinating. Are your presentations done and dusted, Neil? All finished?
Yes, I am done. Yes.
All right. Okay. Neil, huge amount of wisdom, understanding, insight, experience that you've shared with us over the past 3 days. Enormous value that people can benefit from through your presentations. So again, the question keeps popping up in the chat box. And thank you, Wulan, for, you're trying to rush around trying to answer so many questions. The recording, all the sessions have been recorded and are available. They will be available for you to access. Wulan has shared it in the chat box, so anyone can access the full set of recordings at any time. So we're going to move on to the knowledge assessment section now. We're going to give you 20 minutes for us to understand, how much, if any, knowledge improvement has there been in you as an individual and with the group, because we're going to compare your post-course score with your pre-test, pre-course score. And that will give us, an indication of you as an individual, and also for the group, the average knowledge increase. So I'm going to ask Wulan just to explain how to access the site. After the 20 minutes, we'll go back to the Q&A session. For me, the Q&A session is as valuable and important as the actual lectures. Maybe not quite, but almost. Because, it looks at issues that some people feel that have not been adequately covered during the lectures that they still want to have answered. So there are still opportunities for additional learning during Q&A. Let me also address the issue of certificates quickly. Certificates will be generated automatically for everyone who has attended at least 90%, 90 minutes, at least 90 minutes of the 2 hour plus sessions that we've been having every day. So if you have attended at least 90 minutes on each of the 3 days, then you will be receiving a certificate of attendance, no problem. So Wulan, would you mind helping us to share to our audience how to access the link? Just maybe say a word or two. It's up on the screen, everyone.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining until the last day of the training. So I posted the link for the post test, and I also have this on your screen here on the presentation, but it's easier if you can access the link from the chat box. So please try to please try not to use the chat box for the moment so that other participants can see the link. And please not using this chat box for the moment for submitting your email address as well. We have 20 minutes, so hopefully you can complete the test in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Wulan. Okay, so we'll start now. 20 minutes, then we get back for Q&A session. Thank you so much, everyone. Half a minute to go. Okie dokes. I think we have to stop at some point, and our 20 minutes are up. So I think let's move on to the Q&A session now. It's actually fascinating. A whole lot of people are now posting their scores, and some of them are also comparing their pre-test score with a post course score. Uh, One person jumped from 10 out of 25 for pre-course knowledge to 23, I think, out of 25. So a massive increase in knowledge. And that is exactly what we want to see. Some people moved from 21 out of 25 to 23 out of 25. That's still an increase in knowledge. It's still a revision, confirmation of what you already know. So all in all, very positive results and very encouraging. And our sincere thanks to everyone for taking the time and applying your minds to respond to this knowledge assessment course. Thank you so much. Very, very valuable understanding we gain there for future courses and so on. Neil, okay, so we're going to move to the Q&A session now. There's also a course evaluation survey, which we're not going to bother you with now. Wulan, do you want to say something about that? I think we've reached saturation with your concentration and so on, but maybe it's worthwhile just for Wulan or Dr. Porn just to mention about the course evaluation, very, very short survey. Wulan, Dr. Porn, do you want to say something?
I'll leave it with the phone. The phone, please go ahead.
Yes. So the course evaluation survey will be pop up after the webinar, just after the webinar. So you can participate this course evaluation survey. It is not too long, but it is really helpful for us to plan for the next training courses. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Porn. So there'll be a pop-up on the screen. It's a multiple choice checkbox answer. It's a couple of minutes, 1 minute or 2 minutes, very, very short, but it really helps us. So please respond to that. Okay, now I need to share screen, but I need to continually remind myself how to do that. Okay, Neil, can you see my screen?
Not yet. Oh, my email address. I will put it in the chat, but okay, this is scary. I will put it in the chat, but please remember I am traveling and I might take time to respond to your email. My email is, I just wrote it down, nlobo@nd.edu.
That's very kind and very generous. Very, very, very generous of you, Neil.
It's also
We
very,
all
very
know.
scary.
I know, I know. I'm not sure I would do that because you're opening a door to a floodgate of correspondence. But fingers crossed that people will realize that you're a busy person, you have your own life to live, and keep the correspondence to essential needs. So the question here is does the ESBT exist specifically? Is there one available for Aedes mosquitoes, vectors of arboviruses? Or
Great.
to what extent could the existing malaria SBT be adapted for this purpose?
Yeah, great question. There is no ESPT specific for Aedes mosquitoes, but the thing is that, like the logical framework, the steps you take with Anopheles and the ESPT are the exact same steps you would take for Aedes or for sandflies or for any vector. You do the same steps. What is your question? What are the indicators you need to collect to answer your question? And the sampling methods for Aedes are different than the sampling methods for Anopheles. So you would pick from those sampling methods and just go down that logical process. And you can absolutely adapt it for any disease. Yep.
Yeah, great response. Thank you, Neil. Very reassuring to our colleagues deeply involved in the increasing problem of arbovirus threats. So good. So in areas where malaria cases are zero, for example, where elimination has been achieved, but you're continuing with vector surveillance, what questions should one be asking for vector surveillance in those areas?
Great question. So again, this is in context of reduced funding, of alternative priorities. Perhaps dengue cases are going up and malaria cases are zero. So where do you want to spend your resources? If there are no malaria cases, I would perhaps focus on risk factors entomologically, like what things might increase the risk. And I would use a single malaria case to precipitate a larger response. If you look at the ESPT, there's actually a POR section, a prevention of reintroduction section, and what to do. So technically, if you have no malaria, technically, hypothetically, you may not need to do anything because you assume it's not going to come back. But if the expectation is that there's a possibility of it coming back, I would monitor the risk factors. And those would include mosquito populations, Anopheles populations, invasive species like Stevensii in Sri Lanka, and use a single malaria case because that can blow up, right? A single malaria case at your health facility can result in a lot of transmission, and use that to precipitate a larger entomological surveillance response.
Okay. So next question, how effective are the spatial repellents like mosquito shield or whatever in reducing vectorial capacity? Do the repellents cause behavioral change in Anopheles mosquitoes from indoor biting to outdoor biting? And if so, will this cause increase? Just talk around the impact of spatial emanators in terms of vector behavior, etc. Thanks, Neil.
Yeah. So this is a great question, and actually there were a few of them in the chat. So spatial emanators are a new intervention, and they function completely different than IRS or bed nets. They actually impact not just repellency, but multiple things. They can cause knockdown, they can cause death, they can reduce blood feeding. You have mosquitoes that land and they won't feed, even though they landed on the human. So they cause multiple impacts. With all these impacts, yes, you are correct, they reduce vectorial capacity. They reduce the numbers of mosquitoes, and mosquitoes can actually transmit disease. They reduce blood feeding. So they do reduce disease. There are studies that have demonstrated this. The latest is from Kenya, where Eric Ochomo's study demonstrated a 35%, I think, reduction in malaria, which is awesome. There's a study in Indonesia that demonstrated an impact but did not have statistical significance. There was one in Peru that demonstrated impact on dengue. So they impact multiple diseases. So they impact multiple behavioral aspects of mosquitoes. We, just like with bed nets and IRS, should expect over time that the mosquitoes will develop resistance mechanisms to these spatial emanator products. And since these are new paradigms, we don't know what these resistance mechanisms are. They might be associated with insecticide resistance. They might be associated with behavioral resistance. They might be associated with they're not being affected by these low volumes of insecticide in the air, the spatial emanator, right? They might have different flying patterns. They might be moving outdoors more. So they might have multiple impacts that we don't understand well enough, but a well-designed entomological surveillance strategy should be able to capture these differences or changes over time so we can respond to them appropriately. And my last point would be your question of is it moving indoor biting to outdoor biting? And I think what you mean is what is called diversion. So it means, for example, if I have my spatial repellent or my spatial emanator, and my mosquitoes don't come to me as much, but they will go to someone else who does not have the spatial emanator. They might be outside. In the Kenya study was specifically designed to understand diversion. Are mosquitoes being moved to people without the intervention? And they did not see this in that study. And they did not see this because spatial emanators have all these effects besides, in addition to repellency. They cause death, knockdown, reduce blood feeding, and so on. Yeah.
Very reassuring and opens whole new fields of study as well.
Right.
Thanks, Neil.
Yeah.
So this is that thing where you said we're not going to spend, because of limited time, we're not going to talk about the different kinds of sampling
Yeah.
sites and so on. So,
Okay.
but there is a specific question. So maybe just a couple of minutes
Yeah.
on this. Yeah, thanks, Neil.
A sampling site is one that you go to collect your data. For example, I'm in Thailand right now, and we're at a specific sampling site where we're collecting our entomological data. A sentinel site is one that we keep going back to. So if we kept coming back to the site, and we are coming back and collecting the same types of data at the same site, at the same structures, we can understand what's happening over time, over seasons, over years. We can understand the impact of an intervention if we place it in there. And these sentinel sites that we keep coming back to, they are sampling sites, but they're called sentinel because we keep coming back to them and try to collect the same kinds of data. Yeah.
Okay, our mutual friend, Dr. P.T. Joshi. Hello, Dr. Joshi. Nice to have you as part of the audience, part of the course. If only an aspirator and a torch is available as equipment, very resource scarce program, then how do you needful indicators for impact assessment using global fund value for species of vectors?
Okay. I think I understand this question, and let me rephrase it. Perhaps, Dr. Joshi, you mean that if I only have an aspirator and a torch, which means I can only do indoor resting collections, what can we do with this? Like, what can we understand using just indoor resting collections? So if we can only do indoor resting collections, we are only collecting the mosquitoes that are indoors. And we have to realize that those mosquitoes are a subset of all the mosquitoes out there. There are mosquitoes outdoors that don't rest on those walls. There's the mosquitoes that come indoors, feed and leave without resting on the walls. So whatever data we collect is a subset of the entire set of data. And the data that we can collect are the species compositions of mosquitoes resting on walls, the seasonal differences of species resting on walls, the densities of those species, and the indoor resting density of those species. So those are the endpoints we can measure, but we have to ensure that we understand that it's a subset of all the mosquitoes. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Neil. Currently, WHO is giving conditional recommendation endorsement for spatial emanators, but they do not give us suggestions on how we can evaluate the impact of the spatial emanators. Do you want to say something about that,
Sure.
Neil?
This is a great question, and this is something that we are all trying to understand better. And the reason why is that spatial emanators function differently than other interventions. So the indicators we collect need to reflect the mode of action, how spatial emanators are functioning. At present, in the field, possibly the best way of measuring the impact is looking at species-specific indoor and outdoor densities based on HLCs. We are trying to understand more about this, but if you can imagine combining this with human behavior observations, will tell you the impact spatial emanators have on exposure, not on the mosquito densities. We are trying to understand, and we're actually presently working on a manuscript outlining all the essential indicators to measure in different systems, right? Because you might be measuring this in an implementation program, or you might be measuring this in a randomized controlled trial, or you might be doing this in a semi-field system or an experimental hut. And each of these systems, you can measure different things, right? And different levels of things. So which endpoints are appropriate in each of these systems to measure which entomological endpoints do we need to measure that reflect the epidemiological impact we might see? We're working on this. Message me and I can send you the manuscript when we've finished it, because we're trying to put it together right now. Yeah.
Wonderful response. Thank you so much, Neil. Then, can you tell us the best possible strategy to collect human behavior data? I'm not sure if strategy is
Yeah.
or the kinds of question. Oh, yeah. Anyway, maybe
Yeah.
just talk around human behavior data, please,
Sure.
Neil.
So I will do something. I will collect all my human behavior data forms and SOPs, Leo, and I will send it to you. And perhaps you
Wonderful.
can include it in the link so people have access to what we have used, and you can actually adapt this for your own use. I will do that today. What we have been doing so far is that two ways of collecting this data. The first way is to do direct observations. So the person doing the HLC at the end of the hour will just look around, whether he's inside or outside, and see the number of people awake, the number of people asleep, the number of people under a bed net, a number of people not under a bed net. It's an easy form. The person outdoors does that same thing. And it doesn't cost any money. The person's already hired, they're working. So that's the simplest way of doing it and gives us the best data. The second way is to have community questionnaires where you give like the community, let's say the head of the household, form and say, can you please fill this out every day? Like what time everyone goes to sleep, what time they wake up, if they use a bed net. That data is good, but not as good as the direct observations in my experience, but it's still usable. So you can do that as well. So community questionnaires, passively collecting the data, or active observation. And I can send all those forms out to you, Leo.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for that, Neil. Okay, malaria incidence was high, and we decided to collect indoor and outdoor resting mosquitoes, only to find very few, but on checking the larvae, we saw a lot. How do we address this, noting that both indoor and outdoors did not have adult vectors? So, assuming that the larvae, anyway, if you can make some comments there,
Yeah, sure.
Neil. Yeah.
So based on this question, the assumption is that lots of larvae equals lots of adults, right? Now you only used indoor and outdoor resting collections. So you're only collecting resting mosquitoes at the places where you're collecting mosquitoes. So there might have been a lot of mosquitoes that did not rest in those locations, that did not rest indoors. Outdoor resting collections are actually at lots of sites are not that effective. So perhaps you were collecting just a small proportion of all the mosquitoes that were at your site, and you were only collecting the ones that were resting at those sites. So perhaps different sampling measures would enable you to collect a better representation of the mosquitoes around. Of course, I have not seen the data from your site, so I would
No, but that's
suggest,
in,
yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. Uh, yeah, so we've been going very close on 2.5 hours now. I think our audience has good reason to feel that enough's enough now. Thank you. Wonderful session. But I think we're going to ask Dr. Pawn to put that satisfaction evaluation up on the screen. And I am going to extend my heartfelt, genuine, sincere thanks to, first of all, Neil, for the patience, for persisting, giving top quality sharing of experience and wisdom and insights and knowledge. Uh, Obviously, very well appreciated by a global international audience, looking at the numbers of people that consistently kept coming back for more. So if people feel that they're benefiting from it, and they're benefiting from it in many different countries across the world, and I think on behalf of our audience, all of us want to say a great thank you to you, Neil. Job well done. We're very grateful for you spending the time doing that. I also want to say thank you to our audience members for setting aside so much time over three days to be away from your normal work commitments, to take the time to listen to Neil, to learn and benefit from this opportunity. I'm sure you will feel that it's been absolutely worth your while. But to each of you, thank you for being part of this course. And then finally, also to Wulan and to Dr. Pon and to Amanda for being there in the background and doing all the technical backstopping to make sure that everything is up and running, no glitches, and providing us with the questionnaires and so on. So to everyone, very sincere thank you for your participation in making this such a great course. It's been a wonderful event. Please don't go away. Please spend the 2 or 3 minutes that it will take to respond to the survey poll.
Dr. Leo, the survey will be automatically popped up after leaving the webinar.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to end off, say goodbye, and switch off, and then when everybody on the panel has done that, it will pop up. Is it?
Yes, it will be popped.
Dr. Mukhtar, also to you. Thank you for being part of this day 3. My golly me goodness. Wonderful to see your support for APMEN VCWG. Thank you so much. A very good day to all of you. Neil, safe travels, eh?
Thank you.
All
Bye,
right.
everyone.